Welcome to Christianity 125, Introduction to Christianity. This is Dr. Jennifer Bashaw, and this is our very first lecture. We're going to be jumping right in. First, I'm going to do a brief overview of the course, very brief, and then we're going to start talking about the first chapter in our textbook, reading the Old Testament. This is me, Jennifer Bashaw, and this is my family. So that's my husband Carrie and my three boys Noah, Riley, and Isaac. I only had purple hair for one summer. My real color is dark brown, as you see in the bottom picture there. I hope to get to know you a little bit better as we go through this semester. But for now, that's my brief introduction. Over the course of this semester, we are going to be looking at four main units in the Introduction to Christianity. The first is the Old Testament, also known as the Hebrew Bible or the Jewish Bible. The second is the New Testament. The third is church history. And the fourth is Christian theology or practices and beliefs of the church. Please note that this course will be taught from a Christian perspective, and we will try to be sensitive to the Jewish perspective throughout the Old Testament, of course. But many of the things that we say are from the Christian point of view and may not represent any other religions. The very first thing I want us to do is to look at this introductory video that maybe is just an overarching view of the Christian scriptures, looking at the Old Testament and the New Testament, and giving you some background to it. This video is in a series called the Bible Project, and the guys who work on this have just done an incredible job with animation, to look at literary and historical background to the Bible and themes in the Bible and different books of the Bible. So let's go ahead and take a look at this one.
The Bible. It's one of the most influential books in human history.
It explores the big questions of why we exist.
It's inspired many people to do amazing things.
And confused many others.
And you've probably got one sitting around somewhere.
So, what is the Bible actually?
Well, the Bible is a small library of books that all emerged out of the history of the people of ancient Israel. And in one sense, they were just like any other ancient civilization. But among them were a long line of individuals called prophets, and they viewed Israel's story as anything but ordinary. They saw it as a central part of what God was doing for all humanity. And these prophets were literary geniuses.
Really?
Yeah, they expertly crafted the Hebrew language to write epic narratives, very sophisticated poetry. They were masters of metaphor and storytelling, and they leveraged all of this to explore life's most complicated questions about death and life and the human struggle.
So, there's a lot of different authors writing this book.
Yeah, and these texts were produced over a 1,000-year period, starting with Israel's origins in Egypt, then leading up to their kingdom with their first temple, but eventually they were conquered by the Babylonians, who took them away into exile. Then, at a crucial moment in their history, many Israelites returned to their land. They built a second temple, they reformed their identity, and this is when the Jewish scriptures began to be formed into the shape that we have them today.
Okay, the Jewish Bible. What's in it?
Well, in Hebrew, it's called by an acronym, Tanakh. The T stands for Torah, sometimes called the Law. That's Israel's 5-book foundation story. The N stands for Nevi'im, the Hebrew word for prophets. And this section consists of the historical books that tell Israel's story from the prophet's point of view. Then you get the poetic books of the prophets themselves. The K stands for Ketuvim, the Hebrew word for writings. This is a diverse collection of poetic books, wisdom books, and more narrative. And the Jewish people believe that through all of these literary works, God speaks to his people.
Now, there were other Jewish writings being produced during this Second Temple period as well.
Yeah, a really diverse group of texts, and these too were highly valued in Jewish communities. And there was debate from ancient times about whether or not some of these should be considered part of their scriptures.
So, this is a lot of different writings over a long period of time. Why did they put them all together like this?
Well, altogether, these texts tell an epic story about how God is working through these people to bring order and beauty out of the chaos of our world. And it all builds up to a hope for a new leader who would come and renew all creation. And then the Tanakh concludes, and this leader never comes.
So it's an expertly crafted work, but it's missing an ending?
That's exactly right. Now, A few centuries later, a Jewish prophet comes onto the scene named Jesus of Nazareth. He claimed he was carrying the Tanakh story forward.
Yeah, so Jesus did a bunch of cool stuff, was killed, but his followers claimed he was alive from the dead.
Yeah, they said that Jesus was that long-awaited leader who would restore the world. And so his earliest followers, called apostles, they composed new literary works about the story of Jesus. They called these Good News, or the Gospel. They formed an account called Acts about the spread of the Jesus movement outside of Israel, and then they circulated letters to different Jesus communities all around the ancient world.
And they saw these writings as part of the scripture.
Yeah, the apostles wrote all of this as the fulfillment of that epic story found in the Tanakh, and they were continuing the literary genius of the Jewish tradition. They also believed that God was speaking to his people through these texts alongside the scriptures of Israel.
So that's the Old and New Testament. But what did the early Christians think of the other Second Temple literature?
Well, different groups had different views about some of these books, but we know they read them and valued these texts because they passed them along with the Jewish scriptures.
Okay, so we've got the Tanakh, the Jewish scriptures. We got these other Second Temple period works. Then the writing of the apostles about Jesus. And that's a lot of literature, so what's in my Bible?
So the Christian movement has taken different forms over 2,000 years, and from the beginning, all Christians recognized the Tanakh and the New Testament as scripture. And for centuries, much of the Second Temple literature was read as part of the biblical tradition. The Catholic Church eventually made it official and called some of the books from this collection the Deuterocanonical books. Some Orthodox churches used even more books from this Second Temple literature, and then in the 1500s, during the Reformation, Protestant Christians wanted to go back to the oldest writings of the prophets and apostles, so they accepted only the Old and New Testaments.
Okay, I think I got it. But how does a collection of books produced over 1,000 years by all these different authors tell one unified story?
Yeah, that's the question we'll address in our next video.
Hey, I'm John.
And I'm Tim.
So that was a quick and concise overview of the Christian scriptures. We're going to take a look at a couple of the concepts that they discuss in more depth right now. So even though Christians call the Old Testament just that, the Old Testament, the Jews, whose scriptures these were before, call it by another name, the Tanakh. You will see this word sometimes without an H on the end and sometimes with an H. But the Tanakh is an acronym from the three different divisions that the Israelite people or the Jewish people divide these books into. So there are 24 total books for them, for the Jewish Bible, and they're divided into the Torah, which means teaching, the Nevi'im, which means prophets, but covers history in prophets, and then the Ketuvim, which are basically a collection of diverse writings, many of them poetic. The Christian Old Testament is actually the same writings, but they are just divided different ways. We divide them into 39 books instead of 24, and 4 divisions. The Pentateuch corresponds to the Torah, the first 5 books, Pentateuch. The second division is history, and this involves books like Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. Our third division is the wisdom writings, and these include such books as Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes, Psalms. And then our fourth division is prophets, and these include the prophets that typically you would hear about in Christianity: Isaiah, Jeremiah, and many, many others. One of the important background ideas to the Old Testament is that there is a formational event for the people of God or the people of Israel, and that formational event was not the creation or the flood or even the calling of Abraham, the father of their faith, but the Exodus. The Exodus is that time period when Israel found themselves in captivity. They were slaves to the Egyptian people. They cried out to God to save them, and God heard the cry of the people and sent Moses to rescue them from slavery. And this idea of God being faithful to God's people, to calling them out of slavery, rescuing them, is a theme that comes up throughout the Old Testament over and over again. And this is such an important event is because this is when Israel really became a people. They solidified as a group of people who were following a particular God. And you can tell literarily that this is so important because it takes 4 whole books of the Old Testament to tell this story. Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. This is only about a 40-year long story in contrast to Genesis, which is covering hundreds and hundreds of years in just one book. It takes 4 whole books to tell this 40-year story, which means it's important to the storyline of the people of Israel. It is also the crux of their history and story as they go on in history and write more and more books about their lives and their God. They always sort of look back to the Exodus as the formative and as the crux of their history with God. There are many other important historical dates and events in the history of Israel, and so please look at page 14 in your textbook, in the Intro to Christianity textbook, to look for those. We're going to talk a little bit about the Hebrew canon right now, and to talk about the canon, we should tell you what the canon is. The word canon actually means a measuring stick, but what it refers to is an authoritative collection of writings that a group of people agree upon. So Christians have their own canon, that's the Old Testament and the New Testament, and the Jews have their own canon. Here, this is the Hebrew Scriptures, or the Tanakh. And so the canon was formed over a long period of time. The books themselves were actually written probably between 1200 and 200 BCE. And please note that BCE is the same thing as BC. It's a more contemporary terminology that we use. And then CE refers to AD. But these original manuscripts were written in Hebrew, mostly. There's a little bit of Aramaic throughout the Old Testament. And there are 2 major strands of tradition that you can read about in your textbook, the Masoretic text and the Septuagint, the Masoretic being the Hebrew version, and then the Septuagint being the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. But as you are reading through your textbook, make sure you note that it's the Septuagint, the Greek version, that we have the earliest complete copy of. And you can ask yourself as you're reading, why is it not the Masoretic text that we have, if that was the original language and the original documents? So the development of the canon was a complex process. To shorten it down, we know the events from the Old Testament happened various times throughout history, and the stories of those events were told over and over and over again aloud. So we call this oral tradition. So from grandparents to their grandchildren sitting around the fire telling the story of Abraham and Sarah. And so those stories were passed down, and along the way they developed more, and they encompassed different perspectives, different sources. Eventually, many of these stories were written down and collected into books by writers and editors. For example, traditionally we say Moses was the editor for the Pentateuch, but we know there are probably other people involved since Moses dies at the end of the Pentateuch. And then as these stories are written down, they're reinterpreted in light of other events that happen throughout history. So it's a long and complex process. Briefly, you can see that the canonization of each of the parts of the Tanakh happened at different times. The Torah was canonized in 400 BCE, around 400. The prophets, Nebi'im, around 200. And then the writings, the Ketuvim, were not canonized really until probably the end of the 1st century, 100 CE. This is just a map that gives you a geographical perspective on the area that we're about to talk about when we jump into Genesis in the next lecture. Here is the ancient Near East in the Mesopotamian Valley, and Babylon's going to play a big role in the story of Israel. Abraham himself comes from Ur, out in Babylon. And then you can also see the Mediterranean Sea and what is current day Palestine, Israel today. The last thing we want to talk about, and for some reason, there we go. The last thing we want to talk about is just the fact that when Israel is writing their scriptures, they have various views of their God. They think of God as creator, God as being holy, God as being king and judge, and God as being a loving spouse or parent. And we're going to see these themes pop up all throughout our study of the Old Testament. But for now,